Welcome back to the deep dive. We're really incredibly glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Whether you are, prepping for your week or maybe out for a walk or just taking a moment for yourself, we've got a really fantastic exploration lined up for you.
We really do.
But before we jump into the material, let's establish our coordinates. Today is Sunday, 15 March 2026. It is the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is traditionally known as Laetare Sunday. And our source text for today's deep dive is the Gospel of John, chapter 9, verses 1 through 41.
It is quite a substantial passage. And there is a very specific reason it falls on this particular Sunday.
Have you ever actually looked into what Laetare means?
I haven't, actually. I know it as the Sunday the vestments change color. What's the translation?
Latin for rejoice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is a brilliant thematic setup for what we're about to read. It signals this shift from the heavy penitence of Lent into a moment of sudden, just overwhelming joy.
And joy is precisely what crashes into the life of the central character in this narrative.
That makes perfect sense. Because today's mission isn't just to recap some famous miracle. You probably know the basics of the story. Jesus heals a man born blind.
Sure.
But when you look closely at the text, the actual healing takes up maybe 3 verses.
Right. It's very brief.
The rest of this massive chapter is a brilliant, multi-layered story about societal pressure, shifting perspectives.
The psychology of institutional fear.
Yes, exactly. And what it truly deeply means to see. We've got interrogations, we've got intense family drama, we've got some surprisingly sharp sarcasm from a former beggar.
It really is all in there.
Okay, let's unpack this starting right at the beginning, with a moment that honestly feels incredibly relevant to human nature today.
You're looking at the opening scene, right? Where Jesus and the disciples are walking along, and they spot this man who has been blind since birth.
Yes, and the disciples' immediate reaction is just so telling. The very first thing they say is, Rabbi, who sinned this man or his parents that he was born blind? It is such a loaded assumption. They see suffering, and their immediate default instinct is to look for someone to blame.
Yeah, they want a neat, tidy cause and effect reason for this man's tragedy.
Right.
The classic psychological defense mechanism. If we can assign a logical reason to someone else's suffering, like he did something wrong to deserve this, then we can convince ourselves that as long as we follow the rules, we're safe from that same tragedy.
Exactly. It's either his fault or it's his parents' fault. There's just no room for anything else in their worldview.
Right.
So how does Jesus handle that?
Well, what's fascinating here is Jesus' complete rejection of that entire premise. He doesn't entertain their theological debate about generational sin or karmic punishment for a single second. He just shuts it down instantly.
Yeah.
He tells them it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
It truly is. He entirely reframes the narrative of human suffering. He takes something that society viewed as a curse, a literal sign of divine punishment,
Right.
and repositions it as a canvas for grace. He declares, I am the light of the world, and then he moves to bring that light into this man's darkness.
But the way he does it is, well, it's kind of weird.
It is very tactile.
Yeah, he doesn't just wave his hand or say a magic word. He spits on the ground. He literally makes mud with his saliva. He rubs this mud on the man's eyes and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, which the text makes a point to note means sent.
Right.
Why the mud? It feels so incredibly random and frankly unsanitary.
The tactile, gritty nature of this miracle is impossible to ignore. There is a deep symbolic resonance here. In the creation story in the book of Genesis, God forms humanity from the dust of the earth.
Oh,
Yeah, by using the dust of the earth, mixed with his own essence, Jesus is performing a deeply physical act of new creation. He's recreating this man's eyes. It beautifully grounds the divine action in the very literal dirt of everyday life.
Okay, so the man goes, he washes in the pool, and he comes back seeing. You would think this would be a moment of pure, unadulterated celebration in his town.
You'd think so.
But instead, it immediately triggers an identity crisis in his entire neighborhood. The text says his neighbors and the people who used to see him begging are completely baffled. They can't even agree if it's the same guy.
It's amazing.
Some are saying, yes, it's him. Others are saying, no, it just looks like him. How do you not recognize someone who has lived in your neighborhood their entire life?
It highlights something profound about how we categorize people, doesn't it? To his neighbors, he wasn't really a complex human being. He was just the blind beggar.
Yeah.
That label was his entire identity in their minds. When you strip away the blindness and the begging, they literally cannot process the person standing right in front of them. Their brains short-circuit because the label no longer applies.
Meanwhile, he is just standing there insisting, I am the man. I'm the same guy.
Yeah, he's probably so frustrated.
They ask him how his eyes were opened, and he gives a very straightforward, factual account. He says, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes. I went and washed and received my sight.
Right.
At this point, that's the entirety of his theology. Jesus is simply the man called Jesus.
He hasn't formulated a complex worldview yet. He is just reporting the facts of his own lived empirical experience. But unfortunately for him, those facts are about to become highly problematic for the local authorities.
So the neighbors, presumably because they are completely out of their depth and don't know what to do with a miracle, drag this formerly blind man to the Pharisees. And here is where the text drops a crucial piece of context that sets the rest of the story on fire. Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes on a Sabbath day.
That is the spark that ignites the entire conflict.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. We tend to look at the Pharisees in these stories as just cartoon villains who hate joy.
Right.
But they aren't just being jerks for no reason, right?
Yeah.
They have this massive, deeply held legal framework that they believe honors God.
That is a very fair point. In their religious framework, keeping the Sabbath holy was paramount. But they had extrapolated that commandment into hundreds of micro-rules.
Okay.
Specifically, the act of making mud was considered a form of work akin to kneading dough, which was strictly forbidden on the Sabbath.
Wow, kneading dough.
Yeah. Healing itself, unless the person was actively dying, was also considered practicing medicine, which was work. They had constructed an incredibly rigid structure of rules.
But the tragedy is that this very structure made them incapable of recognizing God's actual work when it happened right in front of them. They start interrogating the man. And right away, we see a fracture among the religious leaders themselves.
Yes, there's a clear division within the room. You have one faction that clings desperately to their rules. Their logic is a closed loop. This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. The rule is broken, therefore the person breaking it cannot be holy. End of discussion.
But then you have this other group within the Pharisees who are stuck on the logical impossibility of the situation.
Right.
They're asking, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? It just doesn't compute for them. So because they can't figure it out amongst themselves, they turn back to the formerly blind man and essentially ask for his theological opinion.
Which is pretty funny when you think about it.
Right. What do you say about him? And the man's understanding has already shifted. He upgrades his assessment of Jesus. He says he is a prophet.
But the leaders are so steeped in denial that they decide they don't even believe the man was ever blind to begin with. They need proof. So they call in his parents.
This might be one of the most psychologically heartbreaking moments in the entire text. Put yourself in their shoes for a second.
Yeah.
Your child, who has lived in darkness and poverty for his entire life, is suddenly completely healed. You should be throwing a massive party. You should be jumping for joy.
Absolutely.
But instead, the parents are terrified. The Pharisees ask them, is this your son? Was he born blind? How does he see? And the parents confirm he's their son and was born blind, but then they completely dodge the third question. They wash their hands of the situation.
They do.
They say, we don't know how he sees, we don't know who did it, he's of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. They just throw their own kid to the wolves. Why would they do that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the text tells us exactly why they did this. It says, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue.
Put out of the synagogue? That sounds like just missing a weekly church service. It has to be more severe than that, right?
Oh, infinitely more severe. The Greek term used there is essentially excommunication.
Wow.
In first-century Judea, the synagogue wasn't just a place of worship. It was the absolute epicenter of social, economic, and civic life. Being expelled meant total social death.
So you're entirely cut off.
Yes, you'd be cut off from your community. Your neighbors wouldn't trade with you. You couldn't participate in the local economy. You were a total outcast.
So the fear of that institutional punishment was so overwhelming that it overrode their natural parental instinct to protect their child.
Exactly.
They chose institutional safety over the truth of their own son's experience. It's a chilling reality about human behavior and in-group dynamics, but the parents' deflection sets the stage for round two.
And here we go.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the Pharisees call the formerly blind man back in for a second interrogation.
And this time, they try to force his hand. They start by saying, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." They're trying to dictate his reality. They are demanding that he conform his lived experience to their theological certainty.
It's like a modern courtroom where the prosecuting attorneys are trying to lead the witness.
Yes.
But the man is having absolutely none of it. He gives what might be one of the greatest, most pragmatic defenses in all of ancient literature. He just looks at them and says, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see."
It is brilliant in its simplicity. We're witnessing a clash of epistemologies, how we know what we know. The Pharisees are arguing from a priori theory. Their rules dictate what is possible.
Right.
The healed man refuses to engage with their abstract theory. He grounds his entire argument in an undeniable empirical fact. They are arguing theory. He is testifying to a transformed reality.
And as this interrogation drags on, you can almost see the man's patience wearing thin. They ask him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?"
Yeah, he's done with it.
He is. And this formerly blind beggar suddenly starts dishing out some serious sass to the most powerful religious leaders in the city. He basically rolls his eyes and says, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" It is an ancient mic drop moment.
It's an astonishing display of courage, especially when you consider the contrast. Remember, his parents just caved under the pressure of these exact same men because they were terrified of losing their social standing.
Mm-hmm.
But this man, perhaps because he has spent his entire life on the margins as a beggar, realizes he actually has nothing to lose. The threat of losing social standing doesn't work on someone who never had any social standing to begin with.
That is such a crucial point. His marginalization is actually what gives him his fearlessness. And he doesn't just stop with the sarcasm. He goes on to completely dismantle their arguments.
He really does.
It is a theological takedown from a guy who probably never had a day of formal education in his life. The Pharisees get furious and pull rank. They say, "We are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses. But as for this man, we don't know where he comes from."
Right?
And the man replies, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes."
He essentially points out the massive cognitive dissonance in their position.
Yeah.
He lays out a flawless logical progression drawn directly from their own belief system.
Yeah.
He says, "We all agree God doesn't listen to sinners, but listens to those who do his will. Never in the history of the world has anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. Therefore, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing."
Yeah.
He corners them with irrefutable logic.
He traps them perfectly, and because they cannot counter his logic, they do what people in power often do when they are losing an argument. They resort to personal attacks.
The classic ad hominem.
Exactly. They snap at him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" They revert right back to the very prejudice the disciple started with in verse 2, that his blindness was proof of his inherent sinfulness. And then they cast him out.
They carry out the very threat that terrified his parents. They excommunicate him. They expel him from the community. It is the ultimate exercise of institutional power to silence an inconvenient truth.
Yeah.
When you can't win the argument, you simply remove the person making it.
He's just lost everything. His family wouldn't stand by him, his town won't recognize him, and now his religious community has formally exiled him. But the story doesn't end with him sitting alone in the dark.
No, it doesn't.
Because right after they cast him out, we get this incredibly touching detail. The text says, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, Jesus actually went looking for him. He seeks out the newly minted outcast.
Yeah. Jesus approaches him and asks, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?"
Let's pause there for a second. Son of Man. We hear that phrase a lot, but what does it actually mean in this context? It's not just a poetic way of saying human, is it?
Not at all. It is a heavily loaded messianic title drawn from the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Scriptures. It refers to an apocalyptic, cosmic figure to whom God gives everlasting dominion and a kingdom.
Okay.
By asking this, Jesus isn't asking if the man believes in a nice teacher. He's asking if he believes in the ultimate divine judge and ruler. And the man, showing his remarkable openness, asks, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus reveals himself. "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you."
And what happens next is the culmination of the man's entire journey in this chapter. He says, "Lord, I believe," and he worships him. Think about the progression of this man's faith. It is one of the most fascinating character arcs in the text.
It truly is a beautiful step-by-step trajectory. We need to look at how his language shifts.
Yeah.
Initially, when the neighbors ask him, he just knows his healer as the man called Jesus.
Yeah.
It's purely historical, purely factual. Then, under intense pressure from the Pharisees during the first interrogation, he recognizes a level of divine agency and upgrades him, calling him a prophet.
He defends that realization with flawless logic during the second interrogation, arguing that the healer must be from God.
Exactly. And finally, here at the end, face to face with the one who healed him, and having lost everything else, he recognizes his ultimate identity and called him Lord. As his physical vision was restored instantly, his spiritual vision grew increasingly clear over time, refined by the very opposition he faced.
So what does this all mean? We have this beautiful moment of worship, but then Jesus turns and delivers a statement that feels almost like a riddle. He says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind."
This raises an important question. Who is actually blind in this story? Jesus is pointing to a profound paradox, what we might call the great reversal. The man who was physically blind recognized the truth, embraced the light, and gained deep spiritual sight.
Right.
But the Pharisees, the educated, the sighted, the religious experts who held all the power, they are the ones who were truly in the dark.
And some of the Pharisees are standing right there. They hear him say this, and they immediately get defensive. They ask, "Are we also blind?" And Jesus gives them a devastating answer. If you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say, "we see," your guilt remains.
It's a stunning indictment of their entire worldview.
Yeah.
Jesus is telling them that true blindness isn't the inability to see. True blindness is the arrogant assumption that you already see everything perfectly.
Wow.
If they possess the humility to admit their blindness, to admit their need for light and their lack of understanding, they could be healed. But because they cling to absolute certainty, because they insist we see, their hearts are closed. Their absolute certainty is precisely what makes them incurably blind.
The entire narrative hinges on this idea that true vision requires profound humility. The Pharisees had built an entire existence on rigid adherence to their own rules and their own institutional certainty. That certainty became their biggest blind spot. They were so busy defending their theological fortress, so busy arguing about needing mud on a Sabbath, that they completely missed the divine light shining right outside their door.
Conversely, the man born blind had the ultimate humility. He didn't claim to know everything. He was willing to say, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, now I see. It's an invitation for all of us to let our lived experience of grace inform our worldview, rather than letting our rigid preconceptions deny the reality in front of us.
It is such a rich psychological and philosophical text. It asks us to examine our own echo chambers and our own confirmation bias. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a provocative final thought to mull over this week, based on what we've just discussed. We've talked a lot about the blindness of the Pharisees and their need for certainty. But think about the healed man. Once his eyes were opened to the truth, he lost his community. He lost his family support. He lost his entire way of life in that village. When we ask for the light or the truth in our own lives, are we actually prepared for the incredibly heavy costs that might come with seeing things as they really are? Are we prepared to lose our comfortable, familiar blindness?
That is a phenomenal question. The truth sets you free, but the text shows us it certainly doesn't make things easier.
It really doesn't. And as we conclude today's deep dive, keeping with the tradition of this text, we want to offer a short concluding prayer relevant to today's passage. Lord Jesus, just as you brought light to the man born blind, open our eyes to see your works in our own lives. Grant us the courage to speak the truth even when we face opposition, and the humility to recognize when our own certainty blinds us. Lead us always from darkness into your marvelous light. Amen. Thank you so much for exploring this text with us today. It's been an incredible journey through a truly transformative narrative. Keep questioning, keep seeking, and stay open to the light. We'll catch you on the next deep dive. Take care.